Okay, yeah, so I'm a genetic counselor. I specialize in cancer, and I specialize even further in prostate cancer. And the reason why people come see a genetic counselor for any kind of indication is because there's a family history of cancer. Specifically, if there's a family history of prostate cancer, typically if there's a family history of prostate cancer, we didn't have much that we could offer men. The climate of genetic counseling has changed quite a lot in the past few years. Year by year, we're offering more and more genetic testing as we have more insight to genes that are associated with prostate cancer. And year after year, the criteria that allows us as genetic counselors in Ontario to offer genetic testing to men with prostate cancer, it gets weaker and weaker. And as a result, more men can get testing. So today, I want to talk about where we're at now. We're at a very different place than we were 3 years ago, so there's a lot to kind of update. In this talk, I want to talk very briefly about the basics of cancer. I know that I'm speaking to an audience who's been to a few of these talks. You've met with oncologists, you know what cancer is, so I'll just briefly touch over the subject. And then we're going to spend some time talking about genetics. Then we're going to talk about the different groups of individuals who are at increased risk for prostate cancer. You know what, I'm going to take it off this. There we go. Then we'll talk about the genes that we know of now that are connected to prostate cancer. There's a remote on here. Yeah. Then we'll talk about what we call these panels. And we use this language quite a bit. A panel just means that there's multiple genes that are being tested for. And today in cancer genetics, we have panels for breast cancer, where we test for multiple breast cancer genes, panels for colon cancer, where we test for multiple colon cancer genes. And we have panels for prostate cancer now. We test for multiple prostate cancer genes. So we'll talk about that. The newest thing are these things called polygenic risk scores. And it's a new way of kind of looking at genetics. There's not much literature that's out there on polygenic risk scores. I'll touch over the subject because I think it's going to be very relevant and interesting for the future, but it's still very new now and not something that's being offered on a very regular basis, but that may change in a couple of years. So I figured I'd give a little bit of insight into this in case a conversation like this ever comes up in the future, but I wouldn't expect it to come up now. Then we'll talk about questions. So let's talk about cancer in general. What I have here is a nice little prostate cell. And it's happy it's doing its job. And typically, the course of cancer development is when you have these cells that each have their own job. And the human body is made up of billions and billions of cells, and each cell has their own kind of specific role that they do. So the skin cells do their job, brain cells do their job, prostate cells have their job. And they divide and die on a very regular, organized basis. Cancer is when the process of cells dying and replicating gets disrupted, and it's no longer follows a logical path. A prostate cancer cell that used to be a healthy prostate cancer cell forgets that it's a prostate cancer cell, a prostate cell, and it can start dividing uncontrollably, and it no longer works with its prostate cells around it. It starts acting independently and doing its own thing. It goes kind of rogue. And it's still a prostate cell originally, but it's now kind of become selfish and is just focused on itself. It takes up resources from the rest of the body. It acts independently. It forms a tumor. And sometimes it'll spread to different parts of the body. We call that metastasizing. The process with which this happens is fundamentally genetic. So you have your prostate cell that has its job, and it will accumulate mutations throughout the prostate cell's life. Just like, for example, when you're out in the sun and you get a suntan. What's ended up happening is that you've been exposed to radiation, which has mutated some of your skin cells. And some people will get so suntan that they burn, and the skin comes off. That's because those first layer of cells have become so mutated by radiation that the body says, you have to go. We're going to kill you off because there's too much DNA damage. Well, over the course of our lives, as we age, the cells in our body naturally accumulate mutations. And eventually, if you collect the correct mutations in the correct genes, those cells can start becoming cancerous. So cancer typically is a very natural process, and every guy is at risk for prostate cancer. The lifetime risk is 15%. Every woman is at risk for breast cancer. There's 11 to 12% lifetime risk for breast cancer. And so cancer is a very natural human phenomenon, and it just happens when these normal cells kind of go rogue. So let's talk a little bit more about genetics. So we're very familiar with the topic of cancer, but genetics is a very kind of difficult concept to wrap your head around in some aspects. And so what I have here is a really, really fancy drawing that I stole from the internet. And we have a cell here, and in this cell there's a thing called a nucleus, and that's basically the home of all of the DNA. DNA is stored in these things called chromosomes. And I always make the analogy of the nucleus being like a big library, and chromosomes are kind of like bookshelves. And when you unravel these chromosomes, or you unravel the bookshelf, you eventually get these genes, which are very long pieces of DNA. And they have instructions that tell our body how to grow and how to function. We have about 20,000 different genes that do 20,000 different jobs. A big chunk of our 20,000 genes have the job of protecting us from cancer. Those are the genes I care about. I care about cancer-protecting genes. We have 20,000 genes. We probably have hundreds of cancer-protecting genes. Their specific role is just to protect us. So, because of this kind of analogy of, this is a really difficult, chromosomes look weird when you unravel them. You got these histones, all this little fancy stuff. This looks like a sci-fi picture. So I like to break that down into an analogy that everyone can understand of being this beautiful library. This is in Prague. And it's nice because it has little helical columns here. It reminds me of DNA. So if you look at the analogy of this library in Prague that holds 20,000 books, we have 20,000 genes, so the analogy works really nicely. If you can relate to a bookshelf as being a chromosome and a specific book as being a gene, that's another kind of way of framing how our bodies work. Now imagine this library is in every single cell in your body, and you have billions of cells, trillions and billions of cells in your body. So the important thing about genetics is that we all inherit our genes from our parents. And so when I work in this field of hereditary cancer, I'm interested in these genes. I really like family histories, because if there is a gene that's increasing your risk for cancer, you got that from either your mom or your dad. And so as a result, you also share your genes with your aunts and uncles. And so family histories are super important in making me decide whether or not we should even be investigating genetics. If there's a strong family history of cancer, there's an increased likelihood that there's something genetic that's caused cancer. Otherwise, cancer happened the same way that everything else does. It happened just because naturally humans may eventually get cancer, just like humans may eventually get heart attacks or strokes or suffer from dementia. Cancer is a very natural kind of phenomenon. We always say that about 5 to 10% of cancers are hereditary, meaning that it's some kind of a genetic mistake that's passed on from one generation to the next. And that's what I want to kind of demonstrate here. So I have an example of a woman, and she has these DNA molecules, and it's a long piece of DNA, so it's a gene, and they're holding hands. And the reason why they're holding hands is because all genes come in pairs. We get one copy of our gene pair from mom, we get one copy of our gene pair from dad. And so this woman here has 2 copies of a gene, and we're going to call it a cancer-protecting gene. And both of her copies of her genes are perfect. They look excellent. We have her partner, and he has 2 copies of cancer-protecting genes, but one of them has this red shaded area, and that's a mistake. It means that this gene isn't working very well, or it's not working at all. And so he has 2 copies, or so I guess 1 copy of his cancer-protecting genes, but 1 copy is working just fine, the other copy has a mistake or a mutation. And if we like the book analogy, we have 2 copies of a book, this is the spine of the book, and then this man, he has 2 copies of a book, but 1 copy of his book has a mistake in it, or a spelling mistake. When they go on to have children, the woman who has perfect genes is passing on either 1 copy or the other to her kids. But it doesn't matter which copy she's passing on, because they both look perfect. Same thing with the book. She's passing on these perfect books. The man, however, has a 50% chance of passing on his gene copy that has the mistake, or he has a 50% chance of passing on the gene copy that has no mistake. And so when it comes to genetics and when it comes to heritability, if we see that this is a gene that protects from cancer, if there's a mistake in it, it can't do its job of protecting from cancer as well. This man's at increased risk for cancer. I'd expect him to get cancer at some point in time in his life. And then when he passes on that gene to the next generation, we say that this child is at increased risk for cancer. And this child is not, because they didn't inherit the gene mutation. So this is the typical way with which genes are passed on from one generation to the next. To get back to my point, we have three different ways of kind of describing how cancer happens in individuals. Either it happens by chance, sporadically. That's 70 to 80% of cancers. Or there's something hereditary that's inherited from mom, from dad, that's increasing risk for cancer. That accounts for usually 5 to 10% of cancers. That's my field. I'm in the market of ruling in or ruling out this. If I test somebody who looks like they have a hereditary family and they test negative, I default and I say, hey, well, maybe there's something familial going on. Maybe there's minor genetic factors that I'm not smart enough to understand and the rest of the scientific community doesn't really get yet. Maybe it's the other 20,000 genes that we're not testing for that are increasing risk. And we group that into familial cancer. It's our cute way of saying we don't really know what's going on, but there's something going on. So I want to move on into different high-risk populations. And all of the populations I'm going to talk about right now have something in common. And for some reason, these populations are increased risk for prostate cancer. Some of the reasons we know, and some of the reasons we don't understand, but we all think that it's genetic in some way. So individuals of West African Caribbean ancestry. We know that men who originate from West Africa or the Caribbean are at increased risk for prostate cancer. And we have absolutely no idea why. And this has been very common knowledge for a very long time, and we are getting nowhere when it comes to research and figuring out why. There's a few reasons for that. The reasons why these two areas geographically are at increased risk, well, they have something in common, and that's the slave trade. So individuals from West Africa were moved to, enslaved and brought to the Caribbean. And so we have a population here and a completely separate geographical population here that share one thing in common, and that's their origin, their ancestry. And so we believe that there's something genetic in the West African population that increases risk for prostate cancer, and we see that also expressed in countries of Caribbean ancestry, or countries in the Caribbean. And so every time I give this talk, I show this diagram, which I think is a very, very beautiful diagram. And it's a heat map. The areas that are warmer, so red's warm, and then the areas that are cooler, blue, dark blue is cool, show different things. The warmer areas show the rate of prostate cancer in each country, with red being a high rate and blue being a low rate. And we see that there are certain countries where there are high rates of prostate cancer. North America, the Caribbean a little bit. We see Northern Europe, Eastern Europe, a little bit here in West Africa, not super high. And what we're seeing here is that just a lot of people are being diagnosed. Australia as well is at a higher rate. And some people would say, well, we do PSA testing. It's very easy to detect prostate cancer. Prostate cancer is over-detected. And that kind of makes sense. We can see that. In North America, there's a high rate. In Scandinavian countries, there's a high rate. But what's more interesting is how many people are actually dying from prostate cancer. And if we go back, the same heat map where red is people dying of prostate cancer and dark blue is people not dying of prostate cancer, or low rates of death from prostate cancer, to be more accurate, because I'm on video, so I have to be accurate. The highest, the most red spots are West Africa and the Caribbean. So it's interesting because the rates weren't as high, and some people would say that this detection isn't as high, or people just aren't screening as closely, but the death rates are high. Whereas in North America, the death rates are low. We're picking up prostate cancer, but we're dealing with it quite well. Whereas in these areas, something is increasing risk, but not only that, it's making the prostate cancer more aggressive, and we don't know what it is yet. The other area that I think is interesting is this northeastern Europe, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. In Australia, we see a little bit of a higher rate, and I actually don't know how to account for that. This is a map here that shows rates of death, and we have Trinidad and Tobago, and we compare that to the Scandinavian countries, and then Canada's right here. If we were to include Jamaica, that line would probably be a lot longer, but we can't get stats, or at least we couldn't get stats at the time that this study was done, and that was between 2000 and 2006. So there's a big separate issue, and we know that that's genetic, we just don't know what those genes are. So hopefully that's something that we get a little more insight into in the next little while. The other group that we see an increased risk for prostate cancer, and it makes sense, are guys who have a family history of prostate cancer. So this RR stands for relative risk, and that's risk relative to the general population. So any man who has a brother with prostate cancer, regardless of their age, is 3 times more likely to get prostate cancer than a guy in the general population who has no family history. More significantly, if a man has 2 first-degree relatives, a first-degree relative is a brother or a father. So if he has a father and a brother with prostate cancer, his likelihood of getting prostate cancer is very, very high. Another kind of way of demonstrating this is to compare prostate cancer to other cancers. And so we know that breast cancer has a high rate of there being genetic factors. We know that ovarian cancer is very much connected to genetic factors. Prostate cancer is actually higher than both of them. We know a lot of genes that are connected to breast cancer. We know a lot of genes that are strongly connected to ovarian cancer. We know of very few genes that are strongly connected solely to prostate cancer. So there's a lack of knowledge. So what I want to talk about are some of the single genes, the main players that we know of today that we're working with. And to be fair, there's only about 17 of our 20,000 genes. There's about 17 that are on our radar currently. And then I want to talk about what's coming up and new, where we're kind of incorporating these single genes that we know of, but now looking at our genetics in a more kind of holistic or expansive way, looking at multiple genes, but only certain parts of multiple genes. So we're going to start with looking at what we call monogenic or single genetic factors that increase risk for prostate cancer. So this is he's famous in the research community, but he's not famous otherwise. That's to be argued. Stephen Narod. So he's a huge powerhouse when it comes to cancer genetics, particularly breast ovarian cancer genetics. He played a big role in the discovery and the insight and information into the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes that we know of now that are connected to breast and ovarian cancer and are most strongly connected to prostate cancer. And he came up with a bunch of studies. Some of them are old, but they're still very good, where he looked back at men who had BRCA gene mutations, and he compared their outcomes to BRCA1. He compared outcomes to guys with BRCA2, and what we did is we kind of put in a makeshift line here to look at general population. So I find graphs to be very confusing, so I'll try and break this one down for you. What they ended up doing was looking at something called median survival. So that's to say that there's a group of men, say 100 men, and how many years on average does it take for men with this thing? So this is a man with prostate cancer who has a gene mutation. How long does it take for 50% of those men to pass away from their disease? And what he found was for the BRCA1 gene, to get to 50% of people who have passed away, it took on average around 8 years. For men with the BRCA2 gene, it took on average 4 years. And so this was looking back. It's not what the story is now, but it was to give us this sense that, hey, men with BRCA1 or BRCA2 gene mutations or prostate cancer acts differently. It's more aggressive than the general population. And to be fair, we can't get a median survival for the general population. Because if you take 100 guys and say how long it takes for that man, for 50 of those men to die from prostate cancer, a lot of those men won't ever die from prostate cancer. They'll die from heart disease, from strokes, from everything else under the sun before prostate cancer. And so it's very difficult for us to get that data and compare it to the general population. It just goes to show that BRCA1 and BRCA2 are very, very significant genes that change a man's outcome if prostate cancer is part of his life story. Other genes that we know of are these genes that cause a condition called Lynch syndrome. And Lynch syndrome is primarily a colon cancer genetic condition. It's associated with colon cancer in men. Now we know it's connected to prostate cancer as well. In women, women who have this genetic condition are at increased risk for colon cancer, uterine cancer, and ovarian cancer. And so as a genetics guy, when I'm getting a family history for a man for prostate cancer, I'm interested in knowing about colon cancer history, uterine cancer history, ovarian cancer history, so I can rule in or rule out this genetic condition, Lynch syndrome. These genes can increase risk for prostate cancer from about 15% in the general population to about 30%. And there's 4 genes that cause this condition. To backtrack, BRCA1 and BRCA2, general population risk again is 15%, and a BRCA2 mutation will increase risk to about 30, maybe 35% lifetime risk, whereas BRCA1, just about a 30% lifetime risk. The next gene, HOXB13. So this is the only true prostate cancer gene. It's the only gene that's just associated with prostate cancer and nothing else. The BRCA1 and BRCA2 are connected to breast cancer, ovarian cancer. Prostate cancer is an afterthought. Lynch syndrome, connected to colon cancer, uterine cancer. Prostate cancer is an afterthought. HOXB13, you just think about prostate cancer. So that's a big player. It's a newer gene that's been identified, and it's a part of prostate cancer testing now, but we haven't been testing for this gene regularly for a very long time, so there's still some things we don't know about it. But it may increase risk for prostate cancer as high as 60%. ATM is a gene that is actually relatively common in the general population, but we know that certain mistakes in this gene, ATM, can increase risk for prostate cancer. It also increases risk for breast cancer, and those are the 2 main things that we see. The risk for prostate cancer, again, maybe as high as 30%, but it's another kind of thing that's on our radar. This is a study here that says that if guys have mutations in BRCA1 or BRCA2 or ATM, they might have a higher chance of reclassifying if they're on active surveillance. Reclassifying means they're at Gleason score 6, and if they have a mistake in one of these genes, they might be more likely to get upgraded to Gleason score 7 sooner than a guy in the general population. Another gene that's important is this CHEK2 gene. Specifically, there's a mutation here, which is prevalent in people who are of Scandinavian, Northeastern European ancestry. So if we go back to that heat map, we saw that higher rate of prostate cancer in Scandinavian and Northeastern European countries. Perhaps this might be a culprit to explain that. So here's the thing. This CHEK2 gene is also kind of a culprit for prostate cancer. It can increase risk for prostate cancer, we think, by about doubling the risk, so going from 15% to 30%. But I'm not always convinced that these gene mutations explain the family history of prostate cancer. And the biggest reason for that is because prostate cancer is relatively common. And so can I blame every prostate cancer on one of these gene mutations? Or could a man have gotten prostate cancer just because he's a guy, and he just so happens to have a mutation in the gene like CHEK2 or ATM or BRCA1? So it always puts me at an interesting place, because when I do prostate cancer genetic counseling, I say, okay, well, you do have this CHEK2, and there's a 50% chance that you pass this on to your sons, but if your son inherits the CHEK2 mutation, I know that I want to screen him for prostate cancer starting at age 40. And so I start screening him, PSA testing. And that's really it. All we do is a PSA test in the finger of the bum, a digital rectal examination. Dr. Vesperini will call it a and that's it, no words needed. You can tell him I said that. And then what if the other son tests negative and doesn't have the CHEK2 mutation? I look back at this and I say, hey, did dad get prostate cancer because of that CHEK2? Or did he get it for all the other reasons why guys get prostate cancer? Reasons that we don't understand. And so I'm stuck because I don't know if I can be really assured that this guy, because he didn't inherit the CHEK2, is off scot-free. Maybe there's something else at play. And so for this man, even if he tested negative for that CHEK2 mutation, I'd still want him to get screened by a PSA test starting at age 40. So when it comes to this genetic testing, so what? We found that you have a gene mutation that increases your risk for prostate cancer. Screening for prostate cancer is so simple, so easy. We're going to get your family members to do it anyways, because we're not certain that your prostate cancer happened because of this gene mutation. And so people say, well, why do I test it all? And the other reason is that nowadays, these gene mutations, maybe they increase risk for prostate cancer, but they also might be associated with more aggressive disease, like BRCA1, BRCA2, ATM. And if a guy's on active surveillance and he has one of these gene mutations, maybe he might be more motivated to not be on active surveillance and to get treatment. And so it's another piece of the puzzle when making decisions. So to test or not to test, that really becomes the question. And really, I pose it as a hypothetical scenario, but no one says no to genetic testing. Very few people say no to genetic testing. Usually people are interested in getting as much information as possible, particularly when it comes to making decisions. Okay, so what I have here is this really interesting slide. And what it does is it lists all of the genes that I kind of described, and then plus some. So ATM and CHEK2, we kind of talked about. These genes here are all connected to Lynch syndrome, which we talked about. BRCA1, BRCA2, and HOXB13 I colored differently because it's the only true prostate cancer gene. All these other genes are really, really rare. We don't know too much about them, aside from this gene we know a lot about. But they're very, very rare, and we think that they're connected to prostate cancer, but we don't know too much about how or why. We haven't been testing them frequently enough to know what the risks are if people have these gene mutations. So they're kind of experimental at this point in time. And we call these gene panels. And these are different genetic testing companies that we use to do these gene panels. And it's the reason why I have this slide up is to kind of let you know that less isn't necessary, or more isn't always better. And to really say that these genes aren't necessarily prostate cancer genes. These are breast cancer genes. These are colon cancer genes. These are breast cancer genes and maybe prostate cancer genes. But all of these genes test primarily for something other than prostate cancer. And all genetic people think about other cancers, and then prostate cancer is an afterthought. And so the thing about this is that, and this just kind of lists all the genetic conditions: hereditary breast ovarian cancer syndrome, Lynch syndrome, no real syndrome. This kind of gets to the point of we're not really there when it comes to these single genes that can explain prostate cancer history only. We have genes that explain breast cancer and colon cancer and uterine cancer and prostate cancer, but not just prostate cancer only. The only real gene that we know of is this HOXB13. So people will sell you on a huge genetic panel test for prostate cancer. Really, it's almost the exact same gene panel as a woman who's at increased risk for breast and ovarian cancer. They've just added a couple genes and subtracted a couple of genes. They're branding it and marketing it as a prostate cancer panel because it feels good, but a lot of the time when we do this testing, we don't really find anything. I think that we're barking up the wrong tree, but we're doing the best we can with what we know now. So let's get back to this kind of library analogy. I have 17 arrows here. We have a library of 20,000 books, and we're only ever looking at 17 whenever we do genetic testing for prostate cancer. We're missing a lot. And we know that, and we have to be humble with that because we're still doing the best we can with what we know. To be honest, 2 years ago I was just testing for 2 genes. But again, more isn't necessarily better because the 2 genes I was testing for, BRCA1 and BRCA2, are still the biggest culprits when it comes to prostate cancer that we know of now, aside from HOXB13. Here's where the climate's changing. So before, we never really had a reason to test guys for prostate cancer because we didn't have any studies that showed that guys with prostate cancer have a high rate of finding these single gene mutations. But we know that guys with aggressive prostate cancer are at higher risk of having these gene mutations. And so there's 2 big studies that came out that have given evidence for offering these gene panels to men who have metastatic prostate cancer. And what these studies are finding is that if a guy has metastatic prostate cancer, regardless of his family history, there is about a 12% chance we're going to find a deleterious, which means problematic, mutation or mistake in one of these genes that we kind of discussed previously. And so suddenly that gave a lot of people in the medical community a reason to say, hey, well, all guys with metastatic prostate cancer, if we test them, we're going to pick up 12% of these men are going to have a gene mutation. And that might explain why their prostate cancer is aggressive. And that's very insightful, particularly in the genetics community, where our big threshold for offering genetic testing is if the risk for a gene mutation is 10% or higher. And so this is new. And a lot of genetic centers aren't necessarily on board with it because in Ontario, we don't have any real guidelines. And so we need to be super educated and know about studies like this for genetic testing to be on our radar when we see men who have, for example, prostate cancer that's metastatic. Not all centers will offer advanced genetic testing panels to men who have metastatic prostate cancer. It's kind of a newer thing. In the US, it happens more often, and in Canada, we're warming up to the idea. By the next year, I think it'll be pretty standard, but right now, it's still very new. There's another study that looked at 150 guys who had recurrent metastatic prostate cancer, and they offered a 30-gene panel, and there's 30 genes on there, but they just really found mistakes in the main players that I discussed: BRCA2, ATM, CHEK2, BRCA1. And so if you would have done a 6-gene panel, you would have had a very similar result to a 30-gene panel. But again, it goes on to say that guys with a recurrent metastatic disease, now it's a 14% chance. And so there's more and more evidence showing that, hey, we're not finding these gene mutations in men with run-of-the-mill prostate cancer, but maybe if their prostate cancer is metastatic and aggressive and rare, maybe there's a higher likelihood that it's caused because of some kind of a genetic mutation that they inherited from mom or from dad. So that's our discussion about these monogenic conditions. And that's kind of like reading a book, line by line, page by page, looking for a spelling mistake. New, more innovative stuff is to do what we call polygenic testing. And that is more like looking at just a spelling mistake in a book. You don't read through all 200 pages. You just look at one page, see if a mistake is there. And if it's not, you close the book and you move on to the next book. So it's like going back to your library, and when you do a polygenic risk score, you're just cracking open 100, 200 books, looking at one page, seeing if there's a mistake there. If there is, you note it. If there isn't, you close the book and you move on. And when we do this, scientists have figured out, hey, if there's 100 different spelling mistakes in all 20,000 genes or 20,000 books, 100 of them are somehow connected to prostate cancer. And how they come up with this kind of insight is they look at the whole genome of all these men with prostate cancer, and they say, what do these men have in common? Oh, they have a mistake in book 276 on page 4. Or they have a mistake on book 10 on page 732. And they don't know why these mistakes matter, but they know that there's a correlation. And they can start saying, okay, well, if we're looking at 100 SNPs is what we call them. They're called single nucleotide polymorphisms. It's jargon, but that's like a spelling mistake in a gene. PRS means polygenic risk score, which is our way of, a lot of this is jargon, I apologize for that. This is our way of looking at these simple mistakes. So it's looking at the polygenes and coming up with a risk score based on how many of these SNPs we find. So they've identified 100 of these SNPs that are connected to prostate cancer, and they look at something called an odds ratio, which is a way of kind of saying, what are the odds that someone's going to get prostate cancer if they have a lot of SNPs? If 90 to 99% of the 100 SNPs looked for are present, what's the chance or what's the ratio of men who have this many SNPs who get prostate cancer? And it's high. And if you have 100 or 99 or greater of these SNPs, your ratio of getting prostate cancer is very, very high. And so these are a study where they looked at 43,000 guys with prostate cancer, and they compared it to 43,000 guys without prostate cancer. And they were able to say, guys with these single changes in different pages of their books, if they had these changes, they're at a higher rate of getting prostate cancer. So this is our way of looking at the non-single genes, looking at the whole genome in general, looking at very important parts, taking a quick snapshot to see if a guy's at increased or decreased risk of prostate cancer. The study went on further, and they compared, well, a guy with a BRCA1 or BRCA2 gene mutation, what's his odds ratio of getting prostate cancer? And they have their odds ratios there. And they compare it to guys who did this SNPs, or looking at the multiple genes. And they say, hey, well, if you have a BRCA1 or BRCA2, your odds ratio is about 2. If you have all these different SNPs, your odds ratio is 5, so much higher, so much more predictive to kind of give guys insight into whether or not they're getting prostate cancer. So now what's going to be happening in the future is this might be factored in to maybe active surveillance and saying, hey, if you have a really high polygenic risk score, maybe we should be doing something different in terms of your active surveillance. Maybe you shouldn't be on active surveillance, maybe we should upgrade you. We don't know. Or if you have an ATM mutation and you have a low polygenic risk score, maybe your risk for prostate cancer is actually a lot lower. So we're factoring in this information with your monogenetic stuff to kind of come up with a more accurate way of representing an individual's risk for prostate cancer. So this is our kind of new field, new realm. It's not something that's really on the radar now in Canada, in Ontario, but I think it will be soon. And so it's a new thing to kind of look out for as the years go on. So I want to discuss a little bit about some of the work that we do at Sunnybrook. We run this familial prostate clinic. We see men who either have a disease-causing pathogenic mutation, germline means that it's inherited, in a prostate cancer-associated gene. So we see men with ATM, BRCA1, BRCA2, CHEK2, any guys who have the mutations in the Lynch genes, and we monitor them from afar. If they have prostate cancer, how are they doing? If they don't have prostate cancer, is that going to be part of their life story? And we're collecting that information so we can add it to the literature so that in the future, we'll be able to have more insight and understanding of what happens to men if they have these gene mutations. We also follow guys with just a family history of prostate cancer, and we don't know why. And we're trying to figure out a genetic basis for this. We then also see guys who are of West African Caribbean ancestry. Some men have prostate cancer, some men don't. And we're interested in monitoring them because eventually we're going to want to do genetic studies. And then we can send out an email and say, hey, we're looking at genetic markers specific to guys of West African Caribbean ancestry. We got a DNA sample from you. Can we do this genetic test and see if we can find something that correlates that might be able to explain the increased risk for prostate cancer? We see guys on a regular basis, depending upon what kind of genetic condition we have. They might get mammograms, they might be seeing dermatology for skin cancer, they might be seeing a gastroenterologist for colon cancer. We might refer them on to a geneticist if there's a very, very significant or severe genetic condition that we can't fully manage. And we do the basics, DREs and PSAs. We're famous. We get written up in articles all the time, particularly in Sunnybrook magazine. That's about all that we ever get a focus on. And then we're very, very popular. Dr. Vesprini is clearly the star. This is a picture of Dr. Vesprini here, and this is a picture of me. But it's really just Dr. Vesprini, because he's the star of the show. This is a talk that we did. This is me poking fun at Prostate Cancer Canada in Newmarket for throwing in a picture of Danny Vesprini instead of me. But that's fine, I'm not bitter about it. So that was our familial prostate cancer clinic. Our MORE program is our research program where we're collecting information on guys. We enroll them into registries. We collect their serum and DNA so we can find out if there's anything in their blood that makes them different from other guys in the general population. We have studies going on about doing MRI biopsies, about doing prostate cancer gene panels, thinking about doing genetic panels in guys who are on active surveillance, doing retrospective analysis on the men that we've seen and say, hey, are there any things that these men, that connect these men together that we're overlooking. I want to talk a little bit about a prostate cancer panel study that we are doing. So in this study, if a man has had prostate cancer, Gleason 6, 7, 8, 9, doesn't matter, and he has any family history of prostate cancer, a father, a brother, an uncle, we'll offer him genetic testing. Ministry of Health won't cover this test. It's covered through a research study funded by Prostate Cancer Canada. And we test for these 17 genes that I described. And so far, we're not picking up a lot of gene mutations. And so these metastatic prostate cancer studies are picking up 11 or 12% pickup rate. We've tested 40 guys so far, and we found 3 gene mutations. We're not quite at that 10% pickup rate, and we don't know if all of these are real. Genetics is complex, and so if you test somebody's blood or their saliva, and you look for gene mutations there, it doesn't mean that gene mutation is real. It could be a gene mutation that happened in your bone marrow, and the cells that we test originate from the bone marrow. And so things can be a little bit more complicated than what we're expecting, and that's what this thing is called clonal hematopoiesis. I included this because I gave a talk to a bunch of scientists, and they thought that was really interesting. So I don't think that men who have a personal and family history, I don't think this 17 gene panel is effective in them. I think that it might be effective in men who have metastatic prostate cancer, but maybe not personal family history. I think that we might have to go back to polygenic risk scores, and maybe we can get some insight into men who have a personal family history using that type of genetic testing. But again, we're not there yet. That'll be in the future. Acknowledgements. So I want to thank Dr. Vesprini. He's my partner in crime and my mentor. And then we collaborate with a bunch of different people at Sunnybrook and then in other centers who help us with some of our data analysis and with genetic testing. And that's it for me.